Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about one of the most powerful resources and must-have upgrade for your 3D printer, and we're talking about OctoPrint. Now we're going to talk about what OctoPrint is, maybe why you need it, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to install it. We're going to see how it runs and kind of walk through any problems that you might experience along the way. So if this sounds interesting, let's go. Now you might be sitting at home wondering, what is OctoPrint anyway?
What is OctoPrint anyway?
And OctoPrint is a free open source software that could be used with a Raspberry Pi or an Innovato Quadra or many other solutions really. And it basically acts as a host for a 3D printer so that you can control your 3D prints remotely from your desk, from a Starbucks down the road, or even from a Chinese weather balloon. Another great feature of OctoPrint is really its ability to monitor remotely what is occurring with your print as it's occurring. So you can get an idea for your temperature of the nozzle on your 3D printer or the temperature of your bed on your 3D printer to make sure things are staying consistent and you're getting a really good print. Furthermore, you can get an idea of how much time you have left on the print or even how much filament you have left before the print is done. And perhaps one of the best features of OctoPrint is its plugin system, with the ability to install hundreds of plugins and do things like live monitoring of your prints, or even just a bed visualizer that allows you to see how level or on level your bed actually is. So if we want to take our 3D printing to the next level, OctoPrint really is the next step. And what do we need for OctoPrint to get started? Well, to get started with OctoPrint today and to follow me, you're going to need a 3D printer. I'll be using the Ender 3 Pro. You're going to need a single board computer, and today I'll be using a Raspberry Pi 3A+. These were recently on sale on Parallax for $25. And then we're also going to need a microSD card and a micro USB card. Micro USB cable. Micro USB cable. And of course, to make this all work, we need Raspberry Pi Imager. Raspberry Pi Imager takes an image from your computer and puts it onto a microSD card so that you could put that microSD card into the Raspberry Pi and then have an image on the Raspberry Pi. After you've downloaded the link below for the Raspberry Pi Imager, go ahead and open it up, and it should look something like this. As you can see right here, it's a very simple program, and if you haven't yet, go ahead and plug in your microSD card. Click Choose OS, and then what we're going to do is we're going to page down until we see Other Specific Purpose OSs. When we do that, we see an option here for 3D printing, and we're going to click that. And then we see an option for OctoPi. OctoPi is the operating system that OctoPrint runs on. And then I only have one option on here, and it's cached on my computer. So your option might be a little bit different, but I usually would choose the latest version. And also, this might take a little bit longer for you because I've already downloaded this and it's already on my computer. But go ahead and click on that and then click on Choose Storage next. I only have one option, and it's for my 128 gigabyte SD card. Now, before you hit right, and I know you want to, go ahead and hit that like button, but also go ahead and click the gear icon on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And now we have some other options that are pretty important. Number one, I always check Enable SSH, which allows me to utilize a program like Putty to remotely log into the back end of the Unix machine, or terminal SSH into the Unix machine. And I'll click on Use Password Authentication, which brings us to our next point. Go ahead and check this Set Username and Password option, which will allow you to set a default username and password for this machine install. Make sure you remember your password, but also make sure it's secure, especially if you've enabled SSH above. And finally, configure wireless LAN. Here I put in my SSID and my wireless LAN password or passcode. And also remember that it's case sensitive too, so if you don't type it right, it's not going to work. Anyway, after you click those things, click on your wireless LAN country. Mine happens to be the US of A, and click Save. Now all we have to do is click on Write and wait a little bit of time. If you get an error like this, it's going to say, hey, I'm just reminding you, any data on here is going to be lost. Go ahead and click Yes if you agree. Yep. Well, we're like 80% of the way there, and so what we do need is we need to take our Raspberry Pi, and we need to take that SD card. Actually, that's not the SD card. We need to take the right SD card, and we need to insert this into the Raspberry Pi. But also, I 3D printed poorly a case for the Raspberry Pi. And I say poorly because I still haven't calibrated this printer. What we're gonna do here though is let's hope it fits. If you were to use a Raspberry Pi that was something like a Raspberry Pi 2 or a Raspberry Pi 1 if you could find one, you wouldn't have wireless internet capabilities, but also it's going to run extremely slow on Raspberry Pi or OctoPi as well as OctoPrint. I wouldn't recommend anything slower than a Raspberry Pi 3 Model A+. Not to say it can't be done. Anyway, look at our Raspberry Pi board. Ooh, it's been a long time since we've seen one of these. Wow. Anyway, let's go ahead and get this all plugged in or installed here. Look at that. Not a perfect fit, but a good enough kind of fit, right? And let's see here. We're going to plug our SD card in. All right, so we have our micro USB card plugged into our Raspberry Pi, placed into this nice little Raspberry Pi case, but I have a problem. And that problem is there's only one USB port out, meaning I could plug this into the Ender 3 right here, but I wouldn't be able to do things like utilize my plugins in order to have a webcam. So what I'm going to do to rectify that is I'm going to use this USB hub that I got with my Innovata Quadra, and I'm just going to plug it into my USB-A here. Now, I should also mention that if you have a Raspberry Pi 3B or a 3B Plus or a Raspberry Pi 4, any of them, you have 4 ports on the front of the Raspberry Pi, which would basically eliminate the need for this USB hub. But since this is an A Plus and it's what I got my hands on, we're going to try this. The other thing is we need USB power, which we're going to use a 3 amp USB power supply that goes into a micro USB here on the Raspberry Pi. And then finally, we need a USB-A to micro USB data cable that plugs in from our hub into the 3D printer. In order to do that, today I'm going to be using my favorite brand of USB cables, Assman. Not a sponsor, but everybody loves a good Assman. All right, so now that we have everything hooked up, the power's on, we just need to log into OctoPrint. But how do we log into OctoPrint? I'm going to suggest to you that you log into your router. And if you don't know how to log into your router, there's this website called Google, and Google should be able to help you figure out how to log into your router. Now, once you log into your router, you're going to go to your devices and find the one device that actually is OctoPrint as the host name. So I found it, and mine happens to be 192.168.1.250. So I'm going to type that into a Chrome browser, and I get this. That's not good. What I think is happening here is because OctoPrint is currently setting up as I'm trying to log into it, it hasn't finished building everything it needs to for the operating system. So I'm going to go step away for a few minutes, and when I come back, we'll refresh the page and see what happens. All right, now that it's been a few moments, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just re-enter that IP address in my Google Chrome window. And when I do that and I hit enter, it still says that the OctoPrint server is currently not running. Now this could be a problem with, let's just try that F5 button. After a few moments, if you've waited and you've refreshed your web browser, but you're still getting that error, there could be a few things that are going on. Number one, you could log in via SSH terminal like we talked about earlier, and you could view error logs, but this is an introduction to getting started in OctoPrint. The other thing is though, is maybe while the OctoPrint was booting up the first time, there's a possibility that you either lost power or you unplugged your Raspberry Pi. And while the Raspberry Pi memory card is being booted and everything's installing, unplugging this could have serious consequences like your operating system not working. And if that's the case, just go ahead and plug it in, rewrite the image, and then try again. I'm such an idiot, gosh. After re-imaging the SD card, placing it into the Pi, and then refreshing my web browser, I'm presented with the setup wizard. And we're just going to walk through this. It's pretty simple. So start, hello. Hey, we're going to click next, okay? I don't have a backup file for OctoPrint. This is my first time setting up OctoPrint, but if you did have a backup file, you could restore it here. All right, next up is access control. And here we have to put in a username and a password. Now, I like to leave the username and password or make the username and password different than when I set up OctoPi. As you recall, we created a password when we were setting up the image. And the reason I like to have them different is if I ever need to give out my password for OctoPrint so somebody could log in remotely or somebody could check something out, They don't also have access to the Linux portion or the OctoPi portion of this install. So I just went ahead and I named this Octo Control with the password, randomly generated password, and I click Create Account. And then after access control, I click Next, and we're brought here to configure the connectivity check. And basically, this is just a little thing that's going online and making sure that you still have connectivity to the internet. So I do like to change this to 8.8.8.8 for the host IP. And what that's doing here is OctoPrint comes configured with Google's DNS server 8.8.8.8, and it still shows 1.1.1.1. And if I have concerns about that, I can put in my own IP. So I type in 8.8.8.8 Google server and I hit test, and it says the server is reachable. That's a good thing. Every 15 minutes, I'm going to have this check to make sure I have connectivity. And we're just going to leave the host name as octoprint.org for now. Let's go ahead and enable the connectivity check and click next. And for some reason, it says that I haven't made it so that the check is either enabled or disabled. So I went ahead and I disabled it, and I'm going to re-enable it now and try to click next, and it worked. So that was just a little bit of a bug or something weird that occurred. Now, you could also have the ability for anonymous usage tracking, but I think a good practice, I'm going to go ahead and disable it. Although the tracking would help for bugs in the future to get bugs fixed and certain issues. So basically reporting some kind of usage, how you were using it, certain things that are occurring. It even says it here, by enabling it, you help identify problems with new releases and candidates early on and better help future development to actual use. So you could choose what you want there. Go ahead and click next. And then in the next screen here, we have configure plugin blacklist processing. I'm going to go ahead and enable that. But basically, it even says it to protect against known severe issues with certain versions of plugins. OctoPrint supports the use of centralized plugin version blacklist to automatically disable such plugin versions before they can interfere with normal operation. Sounds straightforward, makes sense to me. That way we prevent problems from occurring. And then finally, our printer profile. Now this should be pretty easy. What we're going to do is we're going to name this thing. So I'm going to call this, I have a lot of Enders, right? So I'm going to call this E3 Pro SKR Mini. And I know now that this is my Ender 3 Pro that is using the SKR Mini V3. Okay, and then model. And then again, this is Ender 3 Pro. This is very generic. There's nothing here that's super important as far as how you get things in. But in this next window, which is print, bed, and volume, we're going to go ahead and click it. And now we need to actually define our Ender 3 and the bed size, the height, and so forth. So our form factor for that Ender printer is a rectangular form factor, and it starts the prints in the lower left. Let's go ahead now and type in 235 by 235 by 250, and that is the bed size. If your printer's print head may move slightly outside the print volume, you can define custom safe bounding mounts for its movements below. I don't need to do that, but I do want to mention, if you don't know the dimensions of your printer, it's your first time using a 3D printer, you could again go to Google and type in your printer and then find the dimensions, right? And we'll actually notice that I have typed them wrong, as we can see here that the print area is 220 by 220 by 250. So we got to go ahead back in here and change that real quick, and 220, 220, 250. Good to go. Click the next button. And then here it says never leave your printer unattended, and I guess that's good advice. We'll talk about that here in a second or two as well. But let's go ahead and click finish, and we should now be loading into OctoPrint, which is pretty exciting. Here it is, OctoPrint. No serial port found. Are you sure your printer is connected? I am sure my printer is connected, but guess what? My printer is not turned on, so let me go do that real quick. Remember when it used to take like 30 minutes for computers to load up? That's not the case with 3D printers. By the way, in theory, you could also have multiple printers hooked up to the same OctoPrint and OctoPi image. But the problem with that is you could only, at the basic way that we're setting things up, you could only use one of them at a time. If I'm printing with one, I can't connect to the other one and print with the other one at the same time. So either using multiple OctoPi installations or having a virtual machine with multiple OctoPi installations would probably be the best thing for you. But anyway, now that our printer's on, we're going to click on the baud rate auto, and then our printer profile this is the only one we have. I'm also going to click on Save Connection Settings and Auto Connect on Server Startup, which I didn't get to do right there. Now things are starting to look good. We have our state in our upper left-hand side, and that tells us what the current state of our printer is, you know, if there's a file printing and so forth. And under here, there's a place for our files. Now you can go onto your computer and you can drag and drop an STL file into this folder. An STL file would be after you slice it with whatever slicing program you use. You could then place that STL in here for 3D printing. Let me give you an example real quick. One of the first things people, and you could actually just drag and drop like that, but one of the first things people print will be a cube for calibration and benchy also for calibration. It's very important as you have a 3D printer, you don't just start printing and think everything's good, kind of get everything dialed in. So there's a benchy. Now, if I wanted to, I could easily hit this print button here, and whatever settings I've defined in my slicing program like Cura, it will take that code from the STL, the G code, and when I click print, it'll send it to the printer. Pretty simple. But there's a few other things here too. Like let's say I don't want to print, or while I'm printing, I need to change the nozzle temperature, right? If I have to change the nozzle temperature, I could use the up and down arrows in Celsius, or I could just turn it off, or I could even preheat the bed. So right now I'm preheating the bed, and I'm gonna wait just a moment so you can see what happens on the chart right here. Now this chart is actually also a really good useful tool for a few reasons. Mainly what happens here on this little display on the main screen is we could see the temperature of our nozzle rising, okay? And it actually goes a little bit higher than the 205 degrees or 210 degrees that I've set it for. Let's see. It actually shows right here, actual temperature at that time was 211 degrees is what I saw. And then it went back down. It actually went down to 204 degrees and now it's rising again. I'm hoping that this will level out. However, if it doesn't level out, I would now know that my thermistor on the printer is not actually, or it's just not keeping the right amount of heat for some reason, like a heat block. And if that is the case, I could try to do what they call a PID tune, which isn't really this episode, but this helps kind of troubleshoot some issues. We know that if I don't have a consistent temperature, I'm not going to get a consistent print. And I could do a PID tune in this terminal tab that's up here. Now in terminal tab, I could clear everything. I could suppress the temperature messages. I could suppress a bunch of messages. And I could even do something like M503, or what I'm trying to tell you is we could run Marlin commands from OctoPrint to the computer, and M503 just happens to send back all the information to me about what's in this printer at the current moment. And this includes things like how our E-steps are calibrated, as well as where our X and our Y offsets are, so forth, things like that, which will be important, especially when you're trying to do a PID tune. You could use this terminal and it will make things a lot easier for you. Again, that'll be all for a later date, but it gives you an idea of what terminal may do. We're gonna go back over to temperature here, and I can see that it's pretty much evened out. It's, let's see, 210.8, 209.5. There's a little fluctuation there, and I might actually just tune up my printer real quick. I'll be right back. And actually, this is kind of cool because it does give you the idea how easy OctoPrint is to kind of implement and use. And so now that I have this PID values from my tune, I am going to set P as 17.14, I as 1.69, and then D as 43.52, and then I'm going to save that into the into the actual firmware itself, and the settings have been stored. So now when we take a look at our temperature, we should be able to turn it back up to, we'll call it 210 degrees Celsius, and we should see a much smoother line. So we now know that we have the ability to modify the temperature of the bed and the nozzle within OctoPrint, and that's kind of cool, right? We could do that while it's printing or while it's not printing. It doesn't necessarily matter, but there's more things we could do. If we click on control, first thing you're going to notice is there's a webcam here. And although that webcam's not really positioned in a great spot at the moment, it will give you an idea of what we could do. We're capable of moving our Z axis up or down, and you could do it in intervals of 0.1, 1 millimeter, 10 millimeters, or 100 millimeters. Now, I will caution you that if you click on 100 and you click up a bunch of times, It's going to try to potentially go up 800 millimeters and so forth. So be careful there. But we could also move our X and our Y axis, as you can see there. And finally, we can click our home button and everything should auto home. Now that's very nice, but another thing we could do is if we had our temperature back up to say 210 degrees for PLA, right? And we were there, we could click on, for example, type in 100 millimeters and we could either extrude 100 millimeters through the nozzle or we could retract 100 millimeters through the nozzle. And that's a pretty useful tool for certain things like measuring stuff. But just to have that ability to remotely do those things. We could turn off all our motors and our fans, or we could turn our fans on. And finally, our flow rate monitor. Now this is nice. Sometimes I'm printing at 100% flow rate. And when I say 100% flow rate, it's to what I defined in my slicer program, Kira. But then I recognize that maybe it's putting out too much filament and I want to adjust my flow rate to 95% or 90%. I could do that here and click set and we're good to go. There's a lot of cool options you could use just on this page alone, and I do like that ability to have the webcam. But a couple other things we could do. Now, if we are printing, we could actually watch the print occur on this screen as well. This is our G-code viewer. And so as it's going through all the G-code commands, we could watch them on text right here, or we could watch them on a nice little screen here, showing it building our 3D print layer by layer by layer. And now finally time-lapse, okay? And so I have time-lapse enabled, and you can actually have it every 5 seconds, every 10 seconds on a timed basis occur, or on Z change. So every time it changes layers, I have it occurring for 5 seconds, and it's gonna throw it all into a time-lapse. And we see our time-lapses on the bottom of the screen once they're done. But I also did mention plugins, and I mentioned how important plugins were. Well, let's click on the top of the screen here. There's a little wrench icon, which is our settings icon. And now there is a lot of different settings that we can go through to get everything set up the way we want it. And we're not going to go over all these today because there's a lot of settings. But here are a few things that you might use OctoPrint for. Number one, I mentioned earlier plugins, and there is a plugin manager down here, and there is a bunch of different plugins, so go check them out. For example, right here, one of my favorite plugins is the bed visualizer, and I don't see it, right? Why is that? Because I can click on get more, and then here, there it is, bed visualizer, and I'm just gonna click on install, and then with any luck, I could have a bed visualizer. All right, it says the bed visualizer is done, so let's see here. Now I could easily go here. Let's see, I'm gonna click on temperature and I don't see anything. Nope, I don't see anything. Maybe I need to, I don't know, refresh or restart OctoPrint, right? And in order to restart or refresh OctoPrint, it's not just refreshing the page like you saw me do right there, but more importantly, it's going down here to the shutdown option and then clicking restart OctoPrint. This will actually restart OctoPrint within OctoPi, the operating system. And this could actually be really good for us to get all our new plugins together. But don't do this while you're printing because then your print will stop, if that makes sense. And just after a moment or so, it will restart all the services on the Pi or the Raspberry Pi. And we should now be presented with somewhere an option for bed visualizer. And now it appears that OctoPrint has rebooted. And hey, one of the cool things is, as I mentioned earlier, now I can click auto connect on server startup. So next time it'll just load right there. But still, where is our bed visualizer? Well, if you click this little, I think they call it a hamburger menu, and then click bed visualizer. Hey, I do want to mention there are certain settings you need to put into your bed visualizer preferences in order for the bed visualizer to properly work. And I can't really tell you what those settings are because each printer brand is going to be different. A BigQ will be different than an Ender and so forth. And hey, there's some G-code required in order to enter the bed visualizer. Again, I just Googled the G-code, but anyway, click save here and let's just try to run that bed visualizer. When I click update mesh, it's going to run some things on my 3D printer. And this really works with automatic bed leveling. So if you have a CR Touch or a BL Touch, this would work good. You should get a result that looks fairly straight across the line, but you might get a result that looks completely off. Level your bed, try again, and so forth. All these things actually play a really big effect into getting your 3D printer to function properly. And I think that's why it was good for me to at least show you how to install OctoPrint, kind of get you familiar with some of these plugins, or at least kind of where to look for them, and get you started off on the right foot, because everything from a nice even first layer on our print all the way up to making sure your bed is level and making sure you're keeping temperature will all affect your 3D prints, not to mention your PID tunes and so forth. So there's a lot more ground that you could cover, but to have OctoPrint is such a valuable resource. Now, one more thing I want to mention here before I take off. The suggestion that we heard earlier was never leave your printer unattended, and there's probably really good practice in that, but it's also not practical. So once you start to build trust with your printer and you're confident that it's working, it's printing okay, it has good bed layers, you should be able to leave it, because like this print behind me, for example, is a 32-hour print, and there's no way I'm just going to sit here and watch this for 32 hours, right? But the nice thing is if I have the ability to remotely log into OctoPi or OctoPrint, I could stop the print if I need to. I could turn off the nozzles so there's no more heat going. I could change the Z-axis to raise it from the bed, and then if I had something like a Casa smart switch, I could shut the printer off completely remotely, which could be a good idea. So that's how you install OctoPrint. I gave you a little bit of extra information in there. I do hope you enjoyed this video. Hope it helped you out. Do me a favor, if it did help you out, hit that like button, but also share this with somebody in the 3D printing community, in the ham radio community, in any kind of community that might be interested in 3D printing. And if you haven't, go check out that QST article from October 2022, where you could learn more about purchasing your first 3D printer. You might see some familiar printers in there. Take care, everybody. Have a good one.